I'm Jacob Schatz.
And I'm Bryce Miller.
And this is Talking Atlas.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Talking Atlas. This week we're jumping face first into lore with another installment in our Across the Multiverse series. In Across the Multiverse, Jacob and I examine a given race, or maybe even really creature type, I guess is the most accurate, across all of Magic's various subplanes.
Today we will be talking about all of the different kinds of elves that Magic has to offer. But before we get too much further, we'd like to pose a question to you all. And that is, what is your favorite elf card? Or set of elf cards, if you have a particularly favorite plane, and you like the elves from that plane. Or if you have one specific card in mind that is your favorite elf to play in Magic. Let us know. Bryce, do you have a favorite elf card figured out?
That's a great question, and I definitely am not running searches now to see if I do. Actually, I think the answer is yes that I do. It's gotta be one of the Simic identity that is blue-green elves. The top two for me, it's going to be a toss-up between Azuri Claw of Progress and Simic Guildmage. Blue-green is my favorite color identity, so of course I'm going to be skewed towards elves in that combination. Azuri is the head of one of my, I don't want to say one of my weirder decks, because to be fair, most of my decks are weird. But Azuri does head a deck that I tend to enjoy playing. On the flip side, there's Simic Guildmage, who on top of having A, absolutely gorgeous art by Alexi Bricklot, and B, an incredible foil printing, does some really weird things. It can move +1/+1 counters, which occasionally happens and happened quite prominently in its original set, Guild Pact, but also can move auras as an activated ability. Moving auras is not a traditionally powerful thing to do, but it does have a few uses, and doing it repeatedly at 2 mana at instant speed is probably one of the best ways to utilize it. How about you, Jacob? Do you have any elves that come to mind?
I do. My favorite elf card is Gilt-Leaf Winnower from Magic Origins. I played Gilt-Leaf Winnower in a green-black elf deck that I ran on Magic Duels, which was the precursor to Magic Arena, which is getting really big right now. And due to a combination of cards in Magic Duels' base card pool, that deck was ridiculous. I ran Monvoli Acid Moss, which was an uncommon, I think, that everybody started off with 3 copies of it, because Duels' card economy was a little odd. It gave you land destruction for 4 mana that got you a forest, and everyone had this for some reason, and they thought it was going to be really fun. And it was fun for me. But Gilt-Leaf Winnower was the biggest, smashiest creature that I had in that elf deck. And not only was it great removal, but a 4/3 body with Menace convinced me that Menace was a force to be reckoned with and definitely deserved its evergreen status, which it got during Magic Origins. Also, the art is pretty sweet. It's a mono-black elf from Lorwyn, that is an elf from the plane of Lorwyn, not from the set, that is in an action pose on the back of a deer that it's riding, I think. As I'm looking at it, the size difference between the two feels a little bit off, but she does look really awesome, and definitely a force to be reckoned with.
When we get over to the Lorwyn Shadowmoor Elves, remind me of Gilt-Leaf Winnower again, because I don't want to jump the gun on some of the stuff we will discuss, but I think it is very representative of a few points.
Will do.
Now, if you have an elf in mind that you would care to pass to us, you can find us on social media and let us know. I'm on Twitter as @walking_atlas. Jacob, you can find
specifically on Twitter this time as @Frogger, spelled PHRAWGER.
You can also stop in at our Discord server, maybe even stay around for a bit. The link to our Discord server is going to be in the description. We'll remind you that later. It's fine. As for the episode topic proper, when Jacob and I discussed doing elves for this Across the Multiverse episode, I actually had to stop and check our schedule to see if we had done it before, because elves are such a core fantasy race, not just in Magic, that I couldn't be sure. They're such a great example of what this series embodies, so it seemed unlikely that we hadn't talked about them before. And indeed, I think we have, but only because they are a good example. We have not delved into more detail.
Elves are the characteristic race for the color green. As a recap, a characteristic race is a smaller race of creatures than the iconic race, which is on the same level as demons and dragons. For green, the iconic race is the hydras. Characteristic races are those that could be represented as characters. They're people, for lack of a more pithier way of saying that. The ideals of green that are embodied in the elves are sometimes reduced to a more physical status, a more literal interpretation of the ideals of green, which is that green likes the natural world. It likes living things, and it really, really likes trees. So, elves in magic, regardless of plane, are stewards of nature. They tend to the plants of a given plane, and they are innately tied to forested locations. However, the elves are still representative of the more philosophical ideals of green. Green tends to shun the more codified, civilized aspects of a modern society. They don't hang out in urban centers, they stick to the wilds. An elf might say to you, why do you take the time to build up the society that, in order to improve it and in order to make it larger, you have to tear through what nature's already built? Nature has built a perfectly serviceable place to live with all of the resources that you'd ever need. So why are you building these big stone icons on where our trees used to be? Regardless of plane, elves are typically depicted as an ageless, beautiful, wise race. And they operate almost exclusively on a big picture scale. And all of these traits are derived from the classical interpretation of elves as laid out by none other than J.R.R. Tolkien in his Lord of the Rings series.
With that background established, let's start jumping across the planes, because there are quite a few of them to get to. With elves being green's characteristic race, almost every plane's small humanoid creatures are elves. The vast majority of planes have elves. Let's start then with Magic's home plane, and the one that has far too many divisions of elves. Dominaria.
The original elves as printed on the cards are, of course, Llanowar elves. But if you're taking a lore first mindset, then the first elves on Dominaria were on the island of Argoth. Argoth was a lovely forested island that unfortunately happened to be on the same plane as Yawgmoth and then Urza, so you know that can't last. Yawgmoth infected all of the elves on the island, and then it got blown to smithereens in the Silex blast that Urza let loose from the, Golgothian Silex.
If you are unfamiliar with this stage of Magic story / Dominaria history, it's because we're going way, way back here, so don't worry yourself too much.
In barest terms, without getting into the deep lore, Urza was the strongest planeswalker ever, basically?
Ever. I'm going to say ever.
Ever. He got in a fight with his brother Mishra over who was better at making stuff. Mishra got taken over by the Phyrexians because he was swayed to their evil ways and lured by power. And then Urza ended the fight between himself and Mishra by picking up a bowl and using it, because that's how old magic plots were settled. Sometimes a guy just had a stronger bowl.
To be clear, they're exploding bowls.
Oh, well that would do it.
At least I think so. I don't otherwise know what... They talk about the blast from the Golgothian Silex. I don't think you can really have a blast unless you have an explosion. Why a bowl can cause an explosion is an exercise that is left to the viewer.
You've got me thinking about this now. Was the Golgothian Silex an exploding bowl that is a bowl built to explode? Or did it only explode because Urza got near it, and suddenly it became the most dangerous bowl in the multiverse?
Well, I'm pulling up the flavor text for Golgothian Silex from Antiquities, and that is, from their earliest educations, the brothers had known that no human contrivance could stand against the true masters of Dominaria. So this indicates that the Golgothians, were some sort of Wait, I thought the Thran were Dominarian's proto-race. What are the Golgothians or the Golgoths?
I have no idea. What you must understand about old school Magic lore is that it was basically the Wild West. You could write anything on a card, and then they had to figure out how it tied back to the lore. It's not like today, where you actually have to have an idea in mind for what the card is representing on the plane, and then you can approve the name and flavor text.
This is, to a large extent, why I constantly rag on Legends and, to a lesser extent, Homelands. They are early Magic sets with not terribly cohesive designs and not at all cohesive flavor profiles, I'll say. Maybe Homelands actually has some cohesion, which is probably the most positive thing I'll ever say about Homelands.
Homelands had a story and has some cool ideas going on in it. The problem is that all of the cards from Homelands were garbage. Sorry, this started with Argoth. Argoth got blown to bits. There used to be elves on it, but now there aren't. All the elves that used to be on Argoth went over to Findhorn and became the Findhorn elves.
But wait, one societal evolution of elves wasn't quite enough, so during Ice Age era floods, the Findhorn elves got pushed out and turned into the Yavimaya elves.
The Yavimaya elves were notable because, and I'm not sure if this is the Findhorn elves that went to Yavimaya or the elves that started in Yavimaya, but the elves at Yavimaya had a hive mind that communicated not only between themselves, but with the land of Yavimaya itself. And so they kind of set the groundwork for the idea that elves are not just stewards of the land, they can commune with the land innately, which is neat. It also doesn't matter because most of the Yavimaya elves have been wiped out through the numerous apocalypses that have gone on Dominaria.
Apocalypse?
Apocalypse?
Yeah, that one. No, octopodopods.
Gesundheit.
It's not even... That phrase doesn't even remotely resemble the sound of a sneeze.
You haven't heard me sneeze, then.
I don't think I want to.
It's a bit eldritch. Llanowar is the next section of elves that we've got from Dominaria. They were the xenophobic followers of Freyalise, who is probably the most famous elven planeswalker. I take that back. Nissa exists. Second most famous elven planeswalker.
I was going to say, Freyalise at least has a card now. Well, a planeswalker card.
She was also up there back in the day. She had a lot to do with once Magic started having real storylines, and storylines that were illustrated in the novels and the comics and such. Freyalise was a pretty major character in a lot of the little subplots that went on. So she wasn't all the way in the background like some of the other characters from way back when. But she's also dead now. But Llanowar's doing okay, I guess.
Well, actually, we don't know for 100% certain that she's dead. She's only probably dead. She's one of the old planeswalkers, and by old planeswalkers, I don't necessarily mean like elderly. I mean the ones that were around before the Mending, the event that reduced the power of planeswalkers from godlike to powerful, but still a sane amount. She was one of the planeswalkers who sacrificed her spark to close one of the rifts on Dominaria, and I'm not going to give you too much more detail there, because we've talked about it before, and we've already gone down a few rabbit holes, and this is not the right elf rabbit hole to go down this episode. That said, she is one of the walkers who disappeared, but didn't necessarily die on screen, which tells me there is the barest chance that if they desire it and have a good reason to, they could bring her back.
I'd believe that. She also happened to, and I'll put die in air quotes, but die during an era of Magic story where a lot of interesting decisions were made about who lived and who died, and a number of them have been reversed. There are two more notable elven subgroups from Dominaria. One of them is the Quirion Elves, which are unique because they were aligned to all 5 colors of mana, which I find kind of interesting because up to this point, elves were so heavily tied to purely green mana as a concept, which made sense with the elven idea of being sort of insular. But Quirion Elves match more with the modern green idea of creating mana, which is to say, all the types of mana exist, so we should be able to tap into them as necessary. They're all part of the natural essence of magic that pervades every plane. We can use them. because we're green and we believe that everything is 5-color.
The last subgroup we'll talk about today, because there are so many more that we will not, are the Havenwood Elves. Historically, these elves are most notable for creating the Thalids, which are I'll say species of semi-sentient fungus creatures. They created the Thalids in an effort to prevent the ice age that was barreling down on Dominaria, but the Thalids accidentally extincted them. Awkward. I think this makes even more poignant the flavor text of a Time Spiral card, Thelon of Havenwood, who created the Thalids. The sight of my Thalids still thriving is a bittersweet welcome to this cold waste. It's, hey, my creation still exists. Oh, right. They killed my people.
It caused an extinction of elves. I didn't even know you could do that. I think that is quite enough time spent on Dominaria, and I apologize if we didn't get to your precise favorite kind of elves from Dominaria, because there's like 12 or 13 different kinds, some of which appear for one line on a flavor text somewhere, or heaven forbid, only in the novels. But let us move on to the plane that we went to when we finally got away from Dominaria, which was Mirrodin. The elves of Mirrodin, like all of the other sapient races of Mirrodin, were not created there or born there, but were pulled there by the soul traps laid by Memnarch. Memnarch used to be the Mirari, got a little oil on him, turned into a big spidery thing that decided that the plane of Argentum, which Karn had created, should have more life on it. So he pulled a bunch of living things onto Argentum, made it Mirrodin, made it a self-thriving ecosystem.
A portion of Mirrodin's elves would eventually be turned into Phyrexian elves, since a lot of Mirrodin was turned into Phyrexian bits. Flavorfully, I don't think much is known of these Phyrexian elves. Aesthetically, they are a lot more coppery and a lot more evilly and kind of severe looking.
They got plenty of teeth.
Sharper, clawier appendages.
The heads on Phyrexian elves looks like they just sort of grabbed the elf at the scalp and motion blurred backwards.
That's pretty accurate, actually.
Though I'm not sure if the slicked back head style is truly indicative of the Phyrexians so much as it is indicative of the art style that was popular around 2010 when Scars of Mirrodin block was around.
And maybe it's not necessarily the art style around that time so much as it is the art style that Mirrodin has dictated.
Yeah.
I have never been overly fond of it. It usually feels, I want to call it cold. And I don't mean cold in its color choices or in its shape language. I mean cold in that many other planes have much more warm, welcoming feeling elements to them. And again, this is not because Mirrodin is a metal plane, or I guess New Phyrexia is a metal plane. But everything about the setting, especially now that it's New Phyrexia, has just not really felt very pleasant. Nothing about the characters are especially aspirational in appearance. Very little about the setting makes me want to actually be there, because I feel like at every turn I'd just be uncomfortable being poked by things or trotting on rough metal ground, and there's nothing to appeal to me. You look at Ravnik, and I can see myself wanting to visit like every street corner. Even Innistrad has its more pleasant bits like Thraben, or maybe some quiet spots in the woods, presuming that you are alone in the woods and not alone in the woods. But not Mirrodin. Almost never on Mirrodin. Speaking of Ravnica, this plane brings us another diversity of elves, and Jacob and I both learned something that we had never considered before. The Gruul, that is the red-green guild on Ravnica, are the only green-aligned guild that do not have elves. I can only imagine that that is a conscious demographic choice on the part of creative, because it has been consistent across all three Ravnica blocks, quote-unquote. We haven't seen beyond Guild of Ravnica, but so far it holds up that the previous two Ravnica blocks had no red-green color identity elves, or mono-green or mono-red elves that were clearly Gruul-affiliated and or had a Gruul watermark.
For the other three green-aligned guilds, however, there are elves aplenty. Specifically, the class of elves that are associated with the Golgari, the green-black fraction?
The green-black fraternity?
The green-black frat. That's actually a lot of frats, probably.
Gamma, upsilon... No. Gamma, beta... What's the third letter going to be?
I have no idea what, like...
I'm going to go with gamma, beta, omega. Because GB, green-black.
Yep.
And then omega, because the end. Death.
Death. Yep.
Dead
Gamma,
things.
beta, omega.
Fungus.
The elves of the Golgari faction are the Devkarin, and they've had their ups and downs between the 3 different scenes that we've had of Ravnica so far. In original Ravnica block, they were represented by Savra, who was queen of the Golgari at the time. They were still in pretty high standing during Return to Ravnica block, because Gerard, an elf, was still the leader of the Golgari. But by Guilds of Ravnica, they have fallen out of favor, because Nicol Bolas has put Vraska in charge of the Golgari Guild. So now the Devkarin are dissidents, and they feel slighted from being removed from a position of power because, well, that is admittedly completely fair, but also because they're elves, and they think they deserve to be in a position of power.
There are some very interesting politics internal to the Golgari. People like the Crawl, the race of insects led by Mazarek, were more or less undesirables. They were lowest on the totem pole in a caste system, and the elves were much, much higher, which is part of why when Vraska helped Mazarek to seize control, well, when Vraska seized control and let Mazarek help, maybe more accurately, she inverted that power relationship. The elves of the Simic, the blue-green Biomancer Guild, are similarly, well, biomancy. Very few, if any, of the Simic elves are just elves, because all Simic have an affinity for grafting other bits onto them to make them not just whatever they originally were.
I think it's telling that the elves, or at least an elf, was also in charge of the Simic back in original Ravnica block. Momir Vig himself was an elf. But by Return to Ravnica block, some pools opened underneath Ravnica, and
Apparently?
we learned that we had merfolk. Because that's fine, and now the merfolk are taking charge as being the leaders of the Simic Guild. And where the Devkarin of the Golgari said, hey, no, that's our turf, the Simic elves were like, yeah, you got way more going on. You are far more Simic than we are, so we should let you be the leaders and learn from you so that we can be weirder.
Do we have any reason to believe that the Simic are kind of deferring to the merfolk? Because I'm not super willing to draw that conclusion that there's been some sort of passing of the torch, just because there's Zagana, the merfolk, as their leader in Return to Ravnica block, and Vorl of the Hulklade as their champion being a human merfolk. It feels like it could be a kind of coincidence that they were led by 2 merfolk.
That's fair. I guess if there was any conflict, it's well in the past by now, because they're mostly settled. There's no power conflict going on within the Simic as far as we know.
To my knowledge, no Ravnica lore has yet gone into what exactly the details of this reemergence of merfolk are. In fact, the only evidence I have to indicate it, and that I'm sure Jacob has as well, is Merfolk of the Depths, the flavor text of which is, when giant sinkholes opened across Ravnica, they revealed buried oceans and the merfolk, once thought to be extinct. This reads to me like, creative wanted merfolk in Ravnica, so we made up a reason for them to be in Ravnica.
Which, although I'm a big story nerd, I think it's probably fine.
No, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It's fine.
Sometimes you just want fish. The last Green Guild of Ravnica, the Selesnya, the Green-White Guild, have far more traditional representations of elves. They're pretty strong warriors, they work well together, they have fancy armor and like performing rituals, which is to say not like dark rituals or nefarious rituals, but just the common everyday rituals of hoisting flags and leading military parades and being elves.
Our next multiversal stop, we have Lorwyn/Shadowmoor. As with almost every race on Lorwyn/Shadowmoor, there's a nice little shift that goes on for the elves. On Lorwyn, they are, in a word, racist. They are so horribly racist. Oh my god.
Yikes.
These elves dig very heavily into the ideas of natural beauty that Jacob described, but they take it to greater extremes. It's not just, oh, look at nature, look at how beautiful trees are. It is the things that are beautiful are things that fit into this particular idea we have that nature made that way. These elves have very prominent horns, and that is one of their most salient measures of beauty. This is illustrated with the card Rhys the Exiled, where as punishment, Rhys had his horns snapped off, which made him an outcast as far as elven society is concerned. Everything that they do not consider to be beautiful, the Lorwyn elves deem an eyeblight. They frequently hunt eyeblights, purely because they have been deemed ugly. Goblins, elves without horns, all eyeblights, they all deserve to be killed for not being beautiful.
This is an interesting twist on a very, up to this point, typically green-aligned race that now has a firm black part added to its color alignment. A black philosophy says there are those that are strong and there are those that are weak, and it is right for the strong to defeat the weak in order to survive. The green part of their philosophy says the natural order is what dictates everything. So it is only natural that those things that are deemed ugly should perish in order to serve those things that are beautiful. It's really harsh. It's hard to reconcile with a lot of the other interpretations of the elves. But if you take those underlying insular feelings of most elven societies and pump them up to 11, then you get the Lorwyn elves.
This is where I check back in with Jacob's card Gilt-Leaf Winnower, because it mechanically demonstrates some of what we have been flavorfully describing of the elves. It's a creature that when it enters the battlefield, you can destroy a non-elf creature whose power and toughness are not equal. It is worth noting that this elf has a non-equal power and toughness as well. And this gets into some of the hypocrisy that's inherent in this philosophy. At least I like to think. The elf is passing a certain judgment that, were it to pass on itself by its own logic, it would be unfit to live.
They're so busy considering the hideousness of things on the outside that they've completely neglected their own hideousness on the inside. Because they're racists. When the Great Aurora passes over Lorwyn, it turns into Shadowmoor, where everything but the elves now wants to kill everything. The elves of Shadowmoor have completely abandoned any idea that they need to seriously uphold the ideals of we kill anything that's not beautiful, and are now bent on protecting the things that are not monstrous in Shadowmoor, which are few and far between. Instead of eliminating those things that are dark, they preserve those things that are light.
We'll now make a brief stop at Alara, which does not have especially prominent elves. Elves were initially exclusive to the Shard of Naya, the green-red-white shard, and after the remerging of the shards, some of them went over to Jund.
And it looks like exactly 3 made it to Bant.
Did they now?
The Sages of the Anima.
You have a particular dissemination of philosophies here. The elves that went from Naya to Jund were generally extending the idea of their gargantuan worship by worshipping dragons, because what is a dragon if not a giant winged gargantua, which is redundant, I know. Though the Sages of the Anima, I am probably a little more confused about, because they would have had to have added blue.
I think that because they didn't have blue mana before, they never saw a sea serpent, because the Sages of the Anima in their art are definitely going, check out that giant sea serpent! That's awesome! I didn't know oceans could happen! Or that they had gods in them.
No, that tracks. That makes sense.
We now head over to Zendikar, where there are a few distinct tribes of elves, which seem to loosely associate with some of the typical D&D classes, because Zendikar was based story-wise or flavor-wise on the ideas of an adventure game. The Joraga seem to fit into the druid archetype. They are the tribe of elves from which Nisa hails, and Nisa is bound to the land and can sense how the land is feeling at any given point. And the Joraga are pretty typical elves. They don't like outsiders. They are very attuned to the forests. In comparison, the Moldaya fit the more shamanistic interpretation of green. Or, for lack of a better word, the barbarian archetype.
And when Jacob says that the Moldaya are sort of more like barbarians, don't take that lightly. The art for Greenweaver Druid, which references the Moldaya in its flavor text, has skulls around whatever the mana is that she's working with there. And you have people like Mina and Den, or those pictured in Into the Wilds, that demonstrate very clear face paint and definitely very tribal-styled markings.
The Moldaya also have the strongest bond to nature because they don't spend all their time in the tops of trees. They spend it on the ground where the trees are actually growing. And unfortunately, they got just wiped out by the Eldrazi and are now led by Mina and Den.
The Mina and Den leading them is not necessarily related to the getting wiped out by the Eldrazi. It's just that there are now few of them. And for those that remain, Mina and Den lead them.
The Taijuru elves are the most outgoing race of elves from Zendikar. They embody the ranger aspects of elven culture. Rangers are associated with staying on the frontiers and leading sort of a dual life between civilization and the wilds. They tread that borderline to protect civilization from the dangers that are out in the wilds, but also ensure that the wilds can thrive without being too encroached upon by civilization.
We have one last plan on our itinerary for today, and that is Kaladesh. Kaladesh, maybe a bit like Mirrodin, raises the question of how do you handle a race that is characteristically closely tied to nature on a plane where nature really isn't the point, because Kaladesh emphasizes artifacts. Well, for one, you restrict them mostly to the parts of Kaladesh that are forests. They're called green belts. There's also a slightly more structured concept of their connection to nature through this idea of the conduit, that there is this great either cycle. It's, for lack of a better term, the circle of life. And the conduit is a quasi-religious embodiment of that.
The green belts are actually a part of Girapur's urban structure. They are places where the buildings have been overgrown with plant life that's tended to almost exclusively by the elves. And because of the way that the elves work with the bureaucracy of Girapur, they actually operate under their own jurisdiction. If there's a conflict between elves, it won't go to the consulate. The consulate will defer to the ruling body within the elven community, and they'll get to meter out their own justice.
In what is frankly a remarkably efficient period of time for the number of planes we had to talk about, that wraps up our Across the Multiverse on Elves. Jacob, if our viewers wanted to come and ask you about your connection to nature, where might they go?
They could find me anywhere they find someone named Frogger, spelled Phrawgger. That's Twitter, that's Tumblr, that's Reddit, and, it's just like all around us, man. You could just go outside, find it, climb a tree, eat a leaf. Just whatever. Just go with the flow. Sorry, I spaced out. What just happened?
Dude.
The leaves are so green.
Except kinda not, 'cause it's autumn where we are, man.
Oh, we are getting an autumn just like Ravnica, and it's so nice. And, Bryce, if someone wanted to ask you about the Argothian elves, or the Findhorn elves, or the Yavimaya elves, or the Llanowar elves, or the Quirion elves, or the Havenwood elves, where would they be able to find you?
They can find me on Twitter as walking_Atlas, or you can email us at info@opalnebula.com. Really, there are so many variants of Dominarian elves, I can't be bothered. Just don't worry about it.
Or the Dalek elves, or the Savaean elves, or the Skyshroud elves, or the Whispering Wood elves, or the Norwood elves, or the Calthan elves, or the
you
Kirin
can find
elves,
us
or the Jamuran
on
elves,
iTunes,
or the Sarpadian
Google
elves,
Play,
or the Tamazine
our
elves, or the
website
Arturian elves.
opalnebula.com, or on YouTube. Are you quite finished?
What about the Fiora elves? We didn't talk about the
Oh
Fiora
my god.
elves. And if for some reason you've enjoyed what you've heard today, please consider finding us on Discord. The link to the Opal Nebula Discord will be included in the description for today's episode at the Opal Nebula website, where you can talk to us about your favorite elf card. Thank you all for joining us once again on this trip across the multiverse. And until next time, happy planeswalking, everyone.